I think that there is a lack of awareness among organizations as to what their actual obligations in NIS2 are. It is challenging because it creates a tension between the actual requirements and effective security operations. At the end of the day, we come back to one of the biggest problems that we see when you have a directive that has such a huge impact, which is you create a framework that lacks harmonization.
Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control. Which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. We've got Nathalie Barrera here today, and she serves as the Director for Privacy for the Europe, Middle East and Africa region at Palo Alto Networks, which is a leading provider of cybersecurity solutions. Her expertise involves the company's compliance with NIS2, which is the newer version of the Network and Information Systems Directive in the EU. And also she deals with the AI Act, the GDPR and DORA, which is the Digital Operational Resilience Act in the EU affecting financial services, and which we covered in a specific episode in the Spanish channel though. She has previously spent 7 years at Cisco Systems, working as a commercial counsel and privacy and security counsel. She studied law and also completed her LLM at the University of Navarra in Spain. With Nathalie, we'll discuss the overlap between cybersecurity, compliance and other building blocks of the EU data strategy, so to speak, so personal data protection, the Data Act and so on. We will touch on the manner in which NIS2 and other EU frameworks affect the global cybersecurity policies or strategies of large enterprises. We'll also talk about the value of compliance beyond the threat of enforcement, and we'll mention transparency, the complexity of data localization, and other things. Let's go for it. Nathalie, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Sergio. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Very good to have you. So, what is the dynamic that we find in Europe at the intersection of cybersecurity and data protection? We have seen lots of data protection here, lots of privacy, but not so much of the interplay with cybersecurity. And what's happening with all the regulations and everything that you see happening in Europe now, please?
So that is actually a very timely topic, because when we think about what's happening in Europe in terms of the data dynamics that we're seeing, we need to be thinking about how the regulatory environment here is rapidly shaping our conversations around data. So we started with the GDPR, which revolutionized, the protection for personal data across the globe. And now we have what is called the European Strategy for Data, which includes the Network and Information Security Directive, which enhances cybersecurity framework obligations for most sectors in the EU. We have the upcoming AI Act, which addresses risks associated with artificial intelligence. And then we have the Data Act, which covers or regulates, I would say, data that is generated and or collected by products and so on. And so what we're seeing in Europe is really a tsunami of regulations that is hitting organizations and users. And what is particularly challenging about this isn't just the sheer volume of new laws that we just mentioned. It's actually the intricate interplay between these various legal frameworks. And so when you have, as we mentioned, GDPR focuses on personal data, we have NIS2, which focuses on network security, we have the AI Act, which focuses on how AI systems are governed and how they impact rights. And for example, we have DORA, which focuses specifically on the financial sector. They all touch on data, they all touch on security, and they all touch on risk, but they do it from slightly different angles. And so for companies today, this means that they can't just track each law in isolation, right? They need to understand how complying with one law might impact or even conflict with the requirements of another, which really creates a truly complex web that is difficult to navigate and track. And so, just to add a little bit more to that, this really brings up the whole significance of the term of Brussels effect, right? What does that really mean? It's the powerful phenomenon where, simply put, the European Union is such a large and influential market and on this topic in terms of regulation that it sets global standards. And so what we're seeing is companies operating worldwide find it more practical and efficient to adhere to all of these rules that we're mentioning, even though they're difficult, rather than trying to manage their own operations following different standards for different regions. And so the European data dynamics, all of these laws that we're seeing come into play, aren't just shaping conversations in Europe, but they're effectively impacting the generation of laws and best practices around the globe as other jurisdictions look to adopt similar principles.
Do you think there'll be a Brussels effect beyond data protection, for example, covering things like DORA for financial services or covering things like even the Data Act?
I think that we will. For example, when you think of DORA, DORA is not a regulation that is necessarily focused on data, but is focused on creating a framework for cyber resilience across the financial sector. And even though the initial target or the intention is to target the European banking system, DORA has the same thing that GDPR has, which is that it has an extraterritorial effect, meaning that to the extent that a banking institution or just considering the broad scope that DORA has, which includes funds, any financial entity in the broad sense of the word, monitors the European market or makes itself available to the European market, it will be subject to DORA,
Yeah.
meaning that you not only comply to the law because it is a great standard to follow, but also because you're subject to the law because of its extraterritorial effect. So we will definitely see that. It's something that is happening. It's happening with the AI Act as well. And so companies will definitely use and leverage these laws to set their standard as to how they need to comply globally.
Very good, thank you. So, what do you think of this? Do you think we've built some sort of artificial barrier between data protection and cybersecurity? As you say, they're clearly intertwined, and you can see both angles. But I tend to see after the GDPR, because we strengthened the discipline so much, we've had DPOs, and DPOs always had a little to do with security because it's just one more principle, right? It's in the GDPR, but they were a separate function. Very clearly defined function, very separate from CISO, from cybersecurity, which was a more mature practice in the company. So what I've seen at many companies is that the DPO or even a CPO, for example, in the US, they will have a much smaller budget than, for example, security. They would go back to cybersecurity or to CISO or to information security every time there's something major or they need help. Every time they onboard a new supplier, it's like the last call is on CISO instead of on privacy. In your experience, have you seen people being able to deal with the whole thing as a single problem or as a joint effort, instead of, again, what I'm telling you, lots of people sort of isolated and having sort of a, I don't know if an artificial barrier between security and data protection, because you do see a lot of the cybersecurity angle. Do you see some people being able to cover it all?
It's going towards that. We in Europe have the GDPR, which obviously is the global standard for the protection of personal data, and now we have NIS2, which is the Network and Information Security Directive, which pretty much harmonizes the cybersecurity obligations across the European Union for critical and essential entities, and so what we see is because of the interplay of these laws, while they have, different primary focuses, one focuses on personal data and the other one focuses on security resilience. I think that these laws come to help that harmonization of the roles within a company because they both intersect at the point of security. So they have a shared goal, right? They're focusing on robust security. So when you think of GDPR, we need to think of the fact that Article 32 requires the security of personal data. NIS2, on the other hand, specifies and strengthens the security measures for network and information security systems. And so where GDPR will require from organizations the implementation of technical and organizational measures to comply with GDPR, these same measures will be looked at or required by NIS2. And so the DPO role will be as critical as the CISO role in that sense, because they both will need to have a very good understanding and will need to educate the business on how to protect, from a security perspective, a company. It cannot be looked at in silos, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I can see the Venn diagram. Okay, so then now going deeper into NIS2, because I'm really lost with NIS2, right? So we explain it here and there at a very high level. It's very interesting, the fact that now it being so strong in Europe, it could force some global companies to observe NIS2, or it could influence legislation in terms of cybersecurity, network security. Do you see a lot of the market struggling with it? How was your experience with NIS2?
I think that there is a lack of awareness among organizations as to what their actual obligations in NIS2 are. It is a directive that is very broad, and at the end of the day, we need to think that this is a directive that applies across the entire European Union, across pretty much all sectors and industries of the European Union, including public sector. And so we've seen that there is a lack of awareness on the obligations that they have, because you need to think that, with the exception of public sector, critical national infrastructure, or really sophisticated companies, medium or small sized organizations do not have cybersecurity as their top priority. And that does not mean that it should not be, but it is just what it is. And so we're trying to work closely with companies to help them understand how we can help them, or how we can enable them to comply with their obligations in NIS2, which are varied. But it is not. I think that the problem that we currently have right now is the tsunami of regulations that we talked about. It is very hard for companies to keep with. At the same time, we have guidelines and different interpretations coming up all the time as to how these directives and regulations need to apply, which definitely did not make it any easier for companies, because they most likely will not have this huge compliance team revising every single thing that's coming out of the European Commission or the Parliament. So that is really hard for them. And so we're trying to do our job, and we're trying to partner with them, to collaborate with them, and to enable them as much as we can. But the reality is that there is still a lot of work to do there.
Yeah, and it's a directive. So are implementations being consistent so far in your experience?
So not really. Initially, there were certain countries, not that many, that directly implemented NIS2 into their national law. So they transposed the directive into national law. But it wasn't until the European Commission said that they were going to take on some fines that really countries started to put their heads down and see how they were going to do that in the fastest and seamless way. So it wasn't consistent. And we need to remember that a directive enables the member state to make changes to the directive as they deem fit. There are obviously limitations, but they can make changes to the law. And so there are different interpretations and transpositions across member states. So what Germany has decided to do something different than the Netherlands, and Spain has decided to do something different than France. At the end of the day, we come back to one of the biggest problems that we see when you have a directive that has such a huge impact, which is you create a framework that lacks harmonization. It really takes you back to GDPR when you had the directive before the regulation. The regulation came because we were looking for harmonization of data protection rules. Will that happen with the NIS2 directive? I don't know, but I really hope that there is an effort to harmonize and simplify all of these regulations, because otherwise it becomes a very complicated puzzle for organizations to really follow.
Yeah, because the whole idea is to have a higher, even if it's a higher bar, have a single bar, as you were saying earlier with, for example, the Brussels effect. So maybe it's Germany becomes the hardest, so let's aim for Germany. But it also has an impact because of that interplay that you were referring to. So the CNIL, for example, just released their annual report. They have this annual report of their activities, right? And I mean, no surprise, data breaches are going through the roof. I don't know if it's, in the UK it's the same. It's like 23-25% increase year on year in terms of reported data breaches, right? You never know exactly the match between reported and the reality, but that's what's happening. So it makes a lot of sense that if we streamline what people need to do for NIST, sorry, not NIST. I have NIST in my head, so I keep saying NIST.
I know.
For NIS2 compliance, that in the end we would mitigate many of the problems that now the data protection authorities are identifying on the security front. So what do you think is a very practical approach as of today for any company to get started? Or are they, I understand they're overwhelmed, there's a lot to do. What's a practical step to get started?
I would say that you need to have a very robust data classification scheme. That's the first thing. You need to understand what data you have and how you need to protect it. Because if you don't understand how sensitive your data is, you don't know what you need to protect it with. That would be the first thing that I would say. And then the second thing is you need to elevate compliance to your board, meaning compliance of specific regulations. Let's take NIS2, which is what we were talking about. It is no longer something that should be left for the legal and the compliance teams. This needs to be something that is elevated to a board level concern, and the executive leadership of a company needs to understand how important this is. And this is, I bring this up because NIS2 and DORA and other regulations are recognizing within the regulation that compliance should no longer be left to the legal and technical functions, but rather it elevates it to a board level concern to the point that it is imposing direct and personal responsibility regimes for these directives. It is really important that the company as a whole understands the importance of complying with these regulations and therefore structures a team that will be solely focused on making sure that the company meets in the most efficient way its obligations.
Very good. So then at board level or at executive level, you also need to make the business case, not just the stick, also the carrot, right? In terms of the metrics or the kind of value it brings to the company. How do you see the internal perception of trust resulting from better security?
This goes back to the fundamental shift that we've seen in the past few years in how companies approach regulatory compliance. And I go back to the checkbox exercise, right? Because we used to think of privacy and regulatory compliance as something that you had to meet, something that you had to tick. And now, any customer and any regulator or any partner that you may have will look at you and how you comply with your own obligations to determine the level of trust that you bring to them. Particularly in the UK and across Europe, simply meeting regulatory requirements isn't enough if you want to build meaningful trust with a regulator or with a partner or with a customer. If you really want to differentiate yourself as a company, you're going to leverage compliance as a foundation to demonstrate deeper commitments around transparency and accountability. And I think that these two principles, I've worked in other technology companies, and these principles are really critical right now if you really want to make a difference and really want to make sure that your products just don't stand up for what they are, which are great. This is not enough anymore. You really need to make sure that your entire privacy and data strategy is directed towards building on these principles.
So, from a European perspective, beyond the brand and beyond consumers and all of this and the perception of trust and so on, are companies rewarded by the market itself as suppliers, as third parties, as data processors, once they start abiding by these frameworks? All I see, from my point of view, whenever, or the audits I've had to do, is that people go after the accreditation, the seal of approval, right? But I do not see the extra effort being rewarded. Is the market getting more sophisticated? And beyond legal compliance, the additional effort that you're doing now, again, because of the different thresholds posed by various implementations of NIS2, is that being rewarded in your experience?
In my opinion, having certifications definitely supports any commitment around accountability that you may have, meaning it's important not only that you do what you say, but that you allow someone else to prove that what you're saying is what you're actually doing, right? And that is accountability. And that is something where certifications come into play, and they're extremely helpful. To your question as to whether or not they do more, given how we've standardized meeting certifications and how these have become worldwide industry standards, I would say that customers are expecting you to have them. It's something that will definitely distinguish yourself against a medium-sized market player, but not against the big players who will most likely have all of them, right? The approach, at least, that companies should take is to make sure that they're having the minimum industry standard certifications and audits that the market requires for the industry that they operate in, and that they make sure that when they prepare for such audit and they try to meet for that audit, that they make the effort to integrate all of these principles and processes into their engineering processes, into their operational processes. Because I think that the benefit of having a certification is not only the stamp. I think that what we've seen as a benefit when we've had customers in our headquarters is that they get the sense that when we say that we meet, let's say, an ISO 27001, and they come, they see that we have been able to implement that as a foundation to our security DNA. So that is really important. It's kind of thinking, it's like if you have an exam and you just prepare for the exam. Are you really preparing for the exam, or is this really something that you want to embed or keep as knowledge, right? Same thing with a company. I think certifications need to be viewed that way. And it's something that definitely adds, but just the mere certification, I would say it's not enough anymore. You need to do a little bit more.
So things are sort of spiraling in a way out of control. So if the law now is chasing that new scenario, very risky, again, there's more hackers everywhere. It seems to be that discipline is growing as well, right? They're getting more sophisticated. So my question is, do you think that now we are getting to the point where the new legal frameworks or NIS2, for example, goes beyond the standards?
I don't know if it goes beyond the effort that it's. Well, we used to have NIS1, right? So we need to think of this NIS2, this version of the Network and Information Security Directive, as a revamped version, which expanded the scope of industries and expanded a little bit on the obligations and tried to harmonize the obligations across the European Union.
How do you balance out the value that people expect from something that they control, through data localization or having things that are processed locally as possible, and at the same time, the very fact that you need to share some basic intelligence about where the threat actors are if you want to be effective? How is that trade-off?
Data localization, which pretty much, it's, to summarize it for in a very simple way, it's the requirement to store data in a specific region, right? There's various forms around it, but that's in a nutshell what it really means. This requirement, which is something that we see frequently in Europe, has become really particularly complex for companies as more jurisdictions implement requirements to keep certain data within national borders, or even when such legal requirements do not exist, companies show a preference to keep data, in a certain region or country. In our industry, in the cybersecurity industry, this is really challenging, and not only from a compliance perspective. It is challenging because it creates a tension between the actual requirements and effective security operations. And so let me try to unwrap that tension. To have effective cybersecurity, most of the time we will need to aggregate and or analyze threat intelligence data across borders. And so, for example, when we detect a sophisticated attack in Australia, we want to be able to bring that data back and share that threat intel across our global customer base within seconds, not days. And so you can understand how data localization would create a fundamental challenge, meaning how do we respect these preferences as a company while maintaining and creating awareness and education around the importance of keeping global visibility to threat intel that we need to protect against threats and threat actors that do not respect borders, right? And so one of the things that we're doing is we're addressing this challenge by doing a balancing act. We're balancing customer demands with security effectiveness. And so, for example, one of the things that we do is we've designed our solutions to allow customers to host their data in region where possible, while enabling secure remote access through strict security and privacy controls. So it's really this hybrid approach between applying appropriate and very robust technical controls and also educating our customers, because we're just not another company in the tech industry. We have a very specific purpose that really justifies the need for the sharing of threat intel. And so that really allows us to meet most regulatory requirements while maintaining, the global visibility to threat intel that we need for effective threat detection and response. And just to go back to the whole NIS2 conversation that we were talking about, companies would not be able to effectively meet their cybersecurity requirements and obligations under NIS2 if we weren't able, as a company or any other provider that operates in this business, to really share that threat intel, because the security would not be at the level that the directive is demanding.
Excellent. Nathalie, thanks again. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Sergio. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Okay, that's all for today. Follow us on Blue Sky, and in the Masters of Privacy Altogether profile, you will find the starter pack, which includes the feeds of all of our past guests. There is also a Masters of Privacy LinkedIn channel, which I invite you to follow, where you will find links to our transcripts, cheat sheets, and other surprises every now and then. Our main website is mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.